Hi, this is Ed. Hope you're doing well. Today we're going to talk about winterization of mowers and engines, mostly from a practical standpoint and also like what's going on underneath the surface that makes this necessary. First, let's talk about the major issues around winterization that make winterization important. So first off, the basic things. If a machine is very dirty and you put it away all winter long, the oil or grease that's on it may dry, or if there's residue on the machine, it's going to have a tighter bond with the paint and that type of thing. So cleaning up the machine is a good thing to do, not absolutely necessary. Also, when you clean your equipment, you become familiar with any parts that are missing or anything that doesn't look right that should receive a tune-up before spring comes. Now, the other thing that's really the more significant issue around winterization is, first we'll talk about the battery. Batteries just generally don't sit well, and so a battery is going to do a lot better if you check that the terminals are corroded or not, clean that up, and start the machine up at least once every 30 days or so, and typically the battery will be fine through the winter. The other option is take the battery off and put it on a trickle charger or something like that, but if you run the machine about once a month, the battery will typically be fine. Now, the engine is where most of the winterization problems occur. So first off, the engine oil, when you have the old oil in there, you've been running it, that oil becomes more acidic, and it's just not great to leave that oil in the engine and for the residue that's in the oil to settle to the bottom of the sump. It's better at the end of your season to drain that oil and put fresh oil in the engine and have that fresh oil sitting there over the winter, and then you're ready for spring. You don't have to worry about that as you're looking at picking up new accounts and busy with other things at the start of the season. Now, the biggest thing around winterization is the fuel system, and that's anything from the gas tanks, the fuel tank grommets, the fuel hoses, the fuel filter, the engines, fuel pump, fuel delivery system, carburetor, EFI, whatever that is. All those components are exposed to the fuel, and fuel degrades over time. Now, let's talk about the fuel's chemistry here for just a quick second. In real basic terms, gasoline is a carbon chain with hydrogens on it. In ethanol, which is something that's been introduced into fuel the last number of years, it's a carbon chain much like gasoline, but on the end of the chain there's an OH, and that oxygen here is a very active molecule, and it will attack many of the different parts that are in the engine's fuel system, and also makes the ethanol less able to absorb moisture into the fuel. So that could be condensation as the tank heats up and cools down every night. It could bring a little bit of fresh air in there, and then that condensates on the fuel tank, and that water has to go somewhere. And with ethanol, it can cause this nasty gel, whereas with traditional gasoline, that water will be absorbed up to some point, and then after that point it stays as liquid water, which is easier to deal with or get pulled through the fuel system. But that gel is pretty hard on the fuel system. Now, fuel that you can get at the pump, you have E10, which is, well, let's first talk about why do we have ethanol. So ethanol is typically a fuel that's made from renewable sources, and there was legislation put into place to roll it out, and it was really intended to address where the fuel comes from, and it really was not done to improve or benefit the engine's efficiency or how the engine runs. And actually, ethanol is a very adverse part of the fuel. It's not really good for the engine at all. And there's different levels of ethanol that are sold out there, and it's good to recognize that not all levels are approved for small engines. So at this point, E10, 10% ethanol, is approved for small engines. But you have E10, E85, or 88 that's offered at the pump. Those fuels are not intended to be used in most small engines and not approved for that use. The other thing to recognize about ethanol is that ethanol does reduce the fuel's energy content. So something like E10 may have about 3% less energy in it. Straight ethanol versus straight gasoline, I think ethanol has about 30%, a little more than 30% less energy in it. So say you have a vehicle that runs E85, that fuel will be less expensive because of the subsidies behind it, but also recognize that that fuel is not going to bring you quite as many miles as E10 pump gas. So when you look at the difference in fuel prices, be sure to account for that. But we're talking about small engines. You really don't want to use any of these fuels in the engine. It can cause a number of issues with whether it be combustion temperatures or the fuel system. So you want to use E10. And even better would be straight gasoline. So if you have a source near you that sells gasoline for boats or something like that, straight gasoline is the best for the engine. But I would say I don't really recommend that you always run straight gas because you're going to pay a premium on it that's not economical. If you're running E10 in your machine and you're regularly using it, it's not a problem. You just don't want to let E10 sit in your machine compared to regular fuel because it goes bad that much quicker. A lot of people say 30 days. In my personal experience, that's about when the gas can just start showing up some issues. Sometimes it'll be fine, but 30 days is a good rule of thumb for your limit on letting ethanol sit. So keep that in mind. If you're filling up fuel tanks and then you're storing them and then you put them in a machine and then the machine's not using it, so you can pretty quickly get to longer periods than that in the off season. Now, there are products like Sta-Bil. A product like this, what it does, first, what's in it. There's a number of different things in it, and some of it's mysterious, but a lot of it is petroleum distillate, sort of, we'll call it kerosene, but it's not really, sort of a type substance like that. And that's the carrier for the additives that are in here, and that helps dilute into the fuel. And the additives that are going in there do a few things. One is it's an antioxidant that neutralizes that O on the end of the chain and keeps that fuel molecule from having some of those adverse effects. The other thing that a lot of Sta-Bil products have, this one's advertised as 360. What they're talking about there is that there's a chemical in here that is vaporizing the internal components of something like a carburetor or whatnot. So it's protecting against corrosion, which is something that can pretty easily happen in the exposure of gasoline or ethanol. So this is both protecting where the liquid is sitting below the level of the liquid, but also above the level of the liquid. It's providing some protection. Now, there's numerous Sta-Bil products out there. This is the marine grade. I believe this has a little bit stronger level of antioxidants. The red Sta-Bil is intended a little bit more. They have some for fuel storage. I think this one's a little bit better for moisture. So if you use the product, that's the biggest thing. Picking exactly which product it is probably matters less, especially if you're not going to store the fuel for 2 or 3 years. But a product like this really does make the difference. I don't think it's practical to put it in your equipment every day you're using it, but your last fill up of the season, there's definitely a benefit to putting a product like this in there. And I think Sta-Bil says that you're fine using up to 4 times the recommended amount. Whenever I use this, I put the recommended amount in and then just a little bit extra for good measure. But you can't put too much in there if you're using it occasionally. The ash content that it produces is pretty minimal for those one-time uses. So some type of fuel stabilizer in your fuel system over the winter will make a big difference. I'm not in the 2-cycle business, so I can't really speak a whole lot to that, but these types of things are even more important in a piece of 2-cycle equipment. The other thing you can do if you don't want to mess around with Sta-Bil, or if you have a smaller piece of 4-cycle equipment, is you can purchase gasoline in a can, straight gasoline, long life gasoline, and just put a pint of that in. You run your fuel real low, put a pint of that in, and just let that sit over winter. That's also a good way to address some of the fuel fouling issues. Now, you can run your engine out of fuel completely and let it sit dry. It's one way to deal with this. The other is to put a fuel treatment in there or to put straight gasoline in the engine. I generally think that the inconvenience of running it empty and then trying to put the equipment away or whatever is kind of a pain. Also, sometimes if you leave the fuel system completely empty, it's not that great on some of the rubber components that then begin to dry rot or dry out. And so sometimes a treated fuel is going to avoid some of those issues. And there is going to be a difference here between fuel injected and carbureted equipment. Carbureted equipment can sit empty fairly fine. Fuel injected equipment has a enclosed fuel system, so it's got a pump and high pressure lines and all these kinds of things. And you really don't want to. It doesn't necessarily hurt an EFI engine to run out of fuel occasionally, but the fuel pump typically is lubricated by the fuel that's in the pump. And so it's really not that great of a thing to continuously run an EFI engine dry. It's going to be better to leave it with fuel in it, and also being sealed in. You're going to have less of those issues like the condensation of water getting into the fuel system and whatnot. So for an EFI engine, I would say you're much better off using some type of a fuel stabilizer treatment, or if your winter's short, just starting the equipment up frequently throughout the winter. And don't leave the fuel injected systems empty necessarily. In general, fuel injected engines are going to be much more tolerant to sitting over winter, and so you typically don't have to give it as intensive of a treatment as something that especially small equipment really struggles with sitting over winter with ethanol in it. So that's the fuel situation. Now, when we bring this to practical terms, you're running a business and there's all these things you could do. There's a few things you might do to mitigate the situation. Let me describe it as 3 levels. So the first level is you don't put any type of treatment in your fuel, but you maybe start the equipment once a month or every 45 days in the winter. That is going to make a big difference. And that's what some people do, especially further south where the winter's a lot shorter. That may be fine in many cases. Now, the mid case would be you're really not doing much to the equipment, but maybe you put a little bit of fuel stabilizer in your last run. That is going to make the next level of improvement. That's definitely the return on the time and the cost of the fuel stabilizer is there to put a fuel stabilizer in your equipment at the end of the season. That's totally worth it. Now, if as you go into the off season, you have some free time and you really want to do the maximum possible thing that you can do, that it may not be the highest return on investment, but the maximum that you could do that would benefit your equipment. That would be that oil change. That would be washing the machine. That would be, you could wax it. You could, those kinds of things. So there are 3 definitely different levels that you can approach this. I think for most people, practically speaking, pouring a dose of fuel stabilizer in the fuel tank of the machine on your last fill up will take the biggest dent out of this. You can also do some things like there's oil fogging treatment you can do to keep your cylinder liners from rusting and those types of scenarios. For our type of equipment and how frequently it's used and that kind of thing, oftentimes the benefit to do that type of treatment is just not there. So overall, that's winterization. I know that across the engine brands, they're going to have different positions and details on some of these things. And what I'm talking about today is not intended to supersede their recommendations. I'm more speaking from my observations and experience with the different fuels and different types of engines. So hopefully this is helpful to you as you get the most out of your equipment. That's what's important to us. We want to sell you equipment that has you're able to make the most money. It's the life cycle cost of the equipment. It's something we talk about all the time, right? You're going to buy the equipment for this, and at some point you're going to run it, you're going to get use out of it, you're going to put maintenance into it, and then when you're done with the equipment, you want to sell it back or trade it in or whatever you're going to do at the end of the life. We want it to be producing a ton of value, very little downtime, and maximum at the end of life. And so I think if we look at maximum life cycle costs, it's a dosage of fuel stabilizer going into the off season, and that's where you're going to get your best bang for the buck in terms of your business and your value of time. So hopefully this is helpful to you, and hope you have a great rest of the winter.